welcome to my channel. I post peaceful, aesthetic videos about tiny living, sustainability, and travel, which are some of my favorite things, though tea and long walks would definitely make it in that list of favorites as well. But anyway, if you like this kind of content, please subscribe, that way you'll see my new videos pop up when I post them. And if you want to make sure to see my new videos, hit the bell button below and you'll be notified when I post more content. As always, please give this video a like, it really helps me out. Okay, so I left you in the middle of my tiny house build with the last video. The walls were framed, but the roof wasn't on yet, and none of the interior finishes had even been started. So today I'll show you the finished house, as well as the second half of the process that got me here. If you didn't see the last video, you can check it out, I'll link it. It walks through the first half of my tiny house build. Stick around for my top 3 tips and my biggest mistakes from building this tiny house. Hopefully you can learn from my mistakes and don't have to learn the hard way like I did. Here we are in my finished tiny house. I left off in the last video with the walls framed, but no roof, so we'll start there. I designed the roof differently than I had seen most people do it online. YouTube was one of my biggest resources in this building project, but I couldn't find anyone who did it exactly how I wanted to do it. Instead of building rafters that were in the shape of a triangle, I actually attached 2 2x6s and braced it with 2 smaller 2x6s on the front and the back. The reason I did this was to preserve headspace in the loft. The peak of the roof ended up being about 13 feet off the ground, and I lovingly refer to my house as a rocket ship because the roof peak is so steep, but it was all for the extra space and I can actually stand up in my loft, which is pretty amazing. Then spanning the 4 rafters, I put 3 2x4s on either side of the roof. This just provided some extra stability and support, and it provided something for me to screw the roofing panels into. I was nervous for this step because I went out on a limb with this design that I chose, but the roof has held up surprisingly well, even in thunderstorms and winds. I have only had one tiny leak that was fixed very easily with a little bit of caulk. When it comes to caulk or wood filler compound, etc., you will find that they often come as warnings. The same can be said for exterior paint, the OSB plywood that I used for subfloor, and the T111 siding that I used on the exterior of the house. These were probably the most toxic supplies that I ended up using in the build, but I decided partway through the project that I needed to prioritize keeping the interior non-toxic over the exterior because of my budget. So what I did is I bought a sealant to paint the interior of the T111 siding to reduce off-gassing. Off-gassing basically means that the chemicals in the product are coming out into the air. I painted the OSB subfloors with a sealant as well. Whenever I handled the OSB board, the siding, the paint, the caulk, and other building supplies, I was extra cautious, wearing gloves and a mask, or sometimes 2, just for my own sanity and peace of mind. Finally, in the home stretch, I painted the exterior white, the trim green, and started to install the windows and the doors, which I also painted green to match the trim. I installed the windows on a hinge, which lets them open outward and allows for a lovely cross breeze in the summertime. I put at least 1 window in each wall to allow for maximum airflow on hot days, as well as maximum lighting. I love natural light so much. I also utilized a concept called passive solar heating to help with the climate control of the house. If you want more details about that, I think I would have to make a separate video about the heating and cooling of my off-grid space. One of my proudest low waste moments was reusing the plastic sheeting that my building supply orders came wrapped in as a moisture barrier in the floor. I stapled down the plastic and waited a few days to make sure no water would actually come in before I put down the insulation and installed the wood floor on top of that. The wood is simply 8-inch, 10-foot long pine boards that have gotten kind of nicked and scuffed, but it's just character, right? I had thought about trying to reclaim wood for the floor, but at this point in the project, prioritizing efficiency was really the choice I wanted to make. I ended up spending a little more on purchasing the wood for the floors, but it was worth it to me to be able to get it done more quickly. Drywall and insulation were both products I bought conventionally. I considered getting a wool insulation, but I just couldn't manage the cost of it. If I were to do a van build or something like that, I think it might be worth it, but with the amount of square footage I had to cover, I just went with a R19 fiberglass bat from the hardware store. The R19 part of that just stands for how well the insulation insulates. The higher the number, the higher performing the insulation is. After installing both the insulation and the drywall, I painted the walls with a low VOC paint to essentially try to seal in any off-gassing from the insulation or the drywall. I didn't do much research on how effective this strategy was, but I was going for peace of mind above anything else. The paint that I initially chose was actually discontinued, so I was able to buy it for, I think it was about half price. The only issue was that I didn't initially buy enough paint. When I went back to get more, they did not have the right base to mix my paint color. That was another learning curve. I did not realize that there were any differences between the paint on the shelf other than like eggshell or extra glossy or whatever it was. I thought it was all the same, but apparently you have to have a low base number for a light color of paint and a higher base number for a darker color of paint. That I did not know, and now I know. That was a pretty disappointing day. During this season of the build, efficiency was becoming a big value for me, and any step that moved me closer to the end of the project was a good one. With the interior built out, I got to move on to the fun part: furniture, window treatments, decor, those kinds of things. I found almost all of my furniture on the side of the road, so I didn't have to buy much. I can't wait to film a video telling the stories of the different pieces I found. I love talking about my trash furniture, probably too much, but it's just so fun to me that I was able to find these things for completely free and on the side of the road. I repainted some of the furniture green with some more of that discontinued paint that I loved so much. I sanded the top of a dresser, which gave me a beautiful wooden countertop. I also cut the legs off of that dresser to make it the same height as another piece I was using for the countertop as well. I cleaned the old hardware, put some baking soda in the drawers and cabinets that smelled a little funky, and I had a furnished house. The best and worst thing about this is when I finished the actual build, I realized I didn't really like building. I can laugh about it now because it's so ironic, but once I got to projects like painting cabinets or hanging curtains or packing up to move in here, I realized how completely out of my depth I had been for so long. I lived for all of those months of building completely outside of my comfort zone, not knowing how to do any of this and learning every day, being a perpetual student, and that really took its toll. Decorating, hanging curtains, and installing furniture felt like the easiest thing in the world after all of that. And that's when I finally realized how intense the build had actually been for me. Like I said earlier, hopefully you can learn from some of my mistakes and not have to learn the hard way. But with a build like this, you really have to be willing to fail. My dad would say, may you have the freedom to fail and the courage to try again. And that's really what you need in a project like this. And it's what I would wish for you. But I also want to share some of my tips for a project like this, some things that I wish I had known when I started my build. My first tip is pay attention to the weather. Unless you have an indoor space where you can do your entire build, being conscious of the weather is paramount. I can't stress it enough. The weather, and honestly myself, but the weather was the biggest antagonist during this project. Yes, a house is meant to be able to withstand the elements, but during the process, many materials can be easily damaged by extended periods of rain or humidity. I lost supplies to mold damage and to warping because the majority of my project was during winter and spring, which are some of the rainiest seasons. So choosing good days and good seasons to work on the project, as well as finding good storage where your materials will not be damaged by the weather, is super important. It can make or break your project. My second tip is buy silicone caulk. Buy a lot of it. You need to give yourself some grace, and for me, grace came in the form of silicone caulk. If you have never built something like this before, or even if you have, you are bound to find gaps in places where pieces just don't quite line up. Silicone caulk was a lifesaver. I tried using a wood filler, but I did not like it. It didn't have the flexibility that silicone caulk does, and it just crumbled. It did not work for me. I say buy lots of silicone caulk, you will thank yourself. I also purchased some non-toxic caulking material for the interior, which gave me peace of mind knowing it wouldn't be off-gassing chemicals into my living space. I'll go ahead and link some of my favorite products below. My third and final tip is don't do it alone. I did almost everything myself, from drawing up the designs to sourcing the materials to installing the furniture. And sometimes during the process, it was extremely lonely. This was my dream, and it took my blood, sweat, and tears to make it a reality. But I had my sister, who was my biggest champion, always knocking on my bedroom door and asking, "Are you gonna work on the house today?" And then she would come out and build with me. I also had a couple of times throughout the project where I asked my community if anyone would be willing to come out for a day and lend a hand. And people came. My students, my bosses, my friends who knew exactly what they were doing, and my friends who had maybe never held a hammer before, they showed up. It would have been impossible for me to do this without support. So find your people. Find your cheerleaders, your motivators, the people you can text and ask for encouragement, or who can convince you to get off your butt and start working even on the worst days. Find those people. I couldn't have done it without those people who were supporting me in so many different ways. It's a hard line to walk between independence and community. Part of me really wishes I could say I built this house all on my own. That just feels like such a badge of honor for some reason. But that's not entirely true. I did. I built it with my own two hands, my own ideas, my own dream, but I wasn't alone.
And actually, that's a really good thing. There were others who came alongside me throughout the process, who went with me to reclaim old windows and doors, who listened to me obsess over the best low VOC paint on the market, or over the insane prices of insulation. Like, really, why does insulation have to be so freaking expensive? Finishing this house was a huge relief for me, and I've spent months now enjoying the space and the time to myself. But there is something so satisfying and fulfilling to not only have this space for myself, but to use it to make space for others. My dreams have begun to shift to not only how do I create safe space for myself, but also to how do I make safe space for those around me. And part of that is here, through this YouTube channel and my other social media. I want to create a safe space where there's beauty and support and someone who believes in your crazy ideas and your ability to make them work. So if you're looking for that kind of community, I'm glad you found this. If anything that I've learned helps you in your process, please let me know in the comments below. I would love to hear from you, to hear what spaces you're creating these days, to hear your thoughts, anything really. I just love to chat. And that's it. How I built and furnished a tiny house for a budget of $6,000. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a lovely week.